According to legend, a Persian caliph once decided it was time to restore order in his land. At his court, he believed there were far too many foreign spies, so he began hunting them down and executing some of them. The caliph was said to be untouchable, guarded by layers of protection. But one morning he awoke to find a dagger placed at the head of his bed, along with a note: "If you don't stop, what now lies by your head will soon be in your heart." The note was from Hassan-i Sabbah, also known as the Old Man of the Mountain, the feared leader of the Assassin sect. And today we're talking about them in a new episode of Hidden History. You've probably heard the word assassin before, maybe from Assassin's Creed or in movies, TV shows, and comics. It's now a common English word for a contract killer, but that word actually comes from the East, specifically from the secretive sect founded by Hassan-i Sabbah. And to call it just a sect would be an understatement. It was more like a full-blown socio-religious and philosophical movement. Religion, in fact, was the foundation. It all started in the 7th century, when the Prophet Muhammad united the scattered Arab tribes under the banner of a new religion, Islam. This was a young and passionate faith, and for the first time, the Arab world was united under one belief system. But that unity didn't last long. After Muhammad's death, Islam split into two major branches that still exist today, Sunni and Shia. The reasons were, as always, a mix of power and interpretation. Sunnis believed the leader of the Muslim world should be an elected caliph. Shiites believed leadership should pass only to direct descendants of the Prophet. But even within Shi'ism, there wasn't unity. Another major split occurred, giving rise to the Ismailis, followers of Ismail, the elder son of the 6th Imam, Jafar al-Sadiq. That movement still exists to this day, and yet the fragmentation continued. In the 11th century, the Ismaili world split again. The ruling Fatimid dynasty in Egypt had two heirs, the younger al-Mustali and the elder Nizar, who was expected to succeed his father. But at the last minute, the caliph handed power to the younger son. Many Ismailis refused to accept al-Mustali and continued to follow Nizar as their rightful leader. But Nizar was captured, imprisoned, and died in captivity. His supporters, the Nizaris, faced brutal persecution. That's when a new leader emerged, both spiritual and political: Hassan-i Sabbah. He was a highly educated man. According to legend, he was friends with some of the intellectual elites of the Muslim world, including the famous poet Omar Khayyam. You may know his Rubaiyat. Hassan was not just a scholar, he was a visionary, deeply devout, and charismatic. In today's terms, he was both a community organizer and a religious leader. He inspired the persecuted Nizaris to follow him into exile. They fled Egypt and took refuge in the remote mountains of Persia. There they discovered a fortress called Alamut, perched high on a cliff and nearly unreachable. And this is where the first great legend about Hassan-i Sabbah was born. He's said to have captured the fortress without bloodshed, convincing the small garrison to surrender through persuasion alone. Once inside, he made it his stronghold and the heart of a movement that would terrify empires. The year is 1090. Hassan-i Sabbah begins building his own state. At that time, the fortress of Alamut was in Persia, and Persia was under Seljuk control. But the Nizaris started spreading their doctrine and expanding their presence. They began to capture nearby settlements and fortresses, some large, some small, and entrench themselves there. Bit by bit, they were building a state within a state. Hassan founded a new movement called Al-Dawah al-Jadida, meaning the new preaching, or call to a new faith. It wasn't quite a new branch of Islam. It was more of a radical current. Let's stick with that term, a current. So what did Hassan do? He abolished Sharia law within his territory and replaced it with an even stricter religious code. Violating it often meant the death penalty. He also scrapped all Seljuk-imposed taxes. Instead, under Hassan's orders, the people paid their dues by building fortifications, canals, new strongholds. This wasn't just a cult. It was a theocracy under construction, complete with military infrastructure. Hassan's teachings were rooted in Islam, but he also borrowed heavily from mysticism and philosophical traditions found across many cultures. In particular, he leaned on a Shia belief about the 13th Imam, a messianic figure who, it is said, lies dormant until Judgment Day. He communicates with the faithful only through chosen messengers. Naturally, Hassan began to position himself as that 13th Imam. Over time, people started calling him the Old Man of the Mountain, though in reality he wasn't that old, probably in his 30s or 40s at the time, but the title stuck. And here's where Eastern legends meet Western myth. The idea of the Old Man of the Mountain eventually morphed in European folklore into the myth of the King in the Mountain, a sleeping sovereign hidden beneath the earth, waiting to return when his homeland is in mortal danger. This legend appears all across Europe. In Germany, it's Frederick Barbarossa, who slumbers in a hidden cave. In Denmark, it's a Viking king. In Poland, a host of knights lie in wait beneath the hills. In England, King Arthur still sleeps. And Merlin wasn't killed, he too sleeps, on some distant isle. These are the sleeping kings who, in times of great peril, will rise from death and lead their armies to purge the land of invaders. If that sounds familiar, think The Lord of the Rings. Remember Aragorn walking through the realm of the dead? That ghostly army that once broke their oath and then redeemed themselves by helping defeat the orc hordes? Tolkien drew directly from the King in the Mountain myth, and it was on this kind of mythic, religious, and mystical foundation that Hassan-i Sabbah began to build his empire. Naturally, the Seljuks, who suddenly had a band of fiery zealots setting up shop right in their backyard, weren't exactly thrilled. They started a campaign against Hassan and his, let's call it a young republic. And I say republic deliberately because for that era, what Hassan created was something totally different. It wasn't your typical feudal state, it resembled more of a utopia. Think Thomas More, centuries ahead of time. It was a very specific, very intentional kind of society. So the Seljuks go to war. On the battlefield, they rack up victories. After all, the Nazaris were few in number, and the Seljuks had superior weapons and armies. And then comes the turning point. Hassan ibn Sabbah has a moment of clarity, a very simple, very practical insight. Why face an army in the open field when you can just quietly eliminate their commanders? Why fight 1,000 soldiers when one dagger could take out a general, a vizier, a sultan, a high priest, even a military strategist? One by one, remove the head and the body collapses. His is the idea that gave birth to a new kind of warfare, targeted, surgical, psychological. And what he created, this doctrine of political assassination, would live on for nearly 200 years. The story of the order truly begins in 1092, in the city of Sabbah. There, a group of Nizari missionaries assassinate a local muezzin, fearing he might expose them to the authorities. The Nizaris lived in secrecy, shut off from the world, trusting no one, keeping everything locked behind metaphorical and sometimes literal seals. The assassins are caught by the Sultan's men. Their fate is brutal, torture and execution. Word of this reaches Hassan ibn Sabbah, the Old Man of the Mountain, and when he hears it, he climbs to the roof of a house in Alamut and makes a declaration. Punishing this sultan is not just a righteous act, it is a sacred duty. May the fires of hell fall upon his head. A young man steps forward. His name, according to legend, is Butahir Irani, and he says, "I'll do it." He sets off to reach the sultan. The target is heavily guarded, elite soldiers, layers of protection. But Butahir spends days observing him, tracking his movements, the palace, the mosque, everywhere he might strike. And then comes the test of absolute resolve. The story goes, Butahir hides for 5 hours, completely still, in a small alcove inside the palace. Pressed against the stone, unmoving, watching, waiting. This trial of patience would later become a standard test for anyone hoping to become an assassin. Finally, the moment comes. The Sultan's guard lets its vigilance slip for just a second. Butahir steps from the shadows and plunges a poisoned dagger straight into the Sultan's chest. The ruler dies instantly. The assassin is killed on the spot. Back in Alamut, news arrives. Hassan has a copper plaque engraved with the name of the assassin and his target, and nails it to the gates of the fortress. In time, more plaques will appear, dozens, then hundreds, because the assassins will strike across the entire Islamic world. Now, where does the word assassins come from? The name is derived from the original label given to the Nizari sect by their enemies, Hashashin, which some say meant hashish users, implying they committed their terrifying killings under the influence. That's one version. Another is that Hashashia was a dismissive term meaning rabble or riffraff, referring to the lowly followers of Hassan ibn Sabbah from the point of view of mainstream Muslims. Either way, the word stuck in history books, in films, in games. Today, assassin simply means a hired killer, but after that first killing, the order began to grow into legend, especially in how it was governed. I called it a republic earlier, and that wasn't by accident. For the time, it really was an anomaly. One leader, the old man of the mountain, Hassan ibn Sabbah, no classes, no wealth, those were outlawed. The society was run through communal structures, each led by a representative who answered directly to Hassan. Religion was paramount, and the laws were brutal. Any violation, even the smallest, meant death. According to legend, Hassan killed one of his sons for suspected conspiracy, and the other just for drinking wine. His daughters were exiled and spent the rest of their lives as spinners. He showed no mercy even to his own blood, which brings up the contradiction. If Hassan was so strict, how do we reconcile that with the name assassins, the supposed hashish users? It doesn't add up. Some historians think the drug claim was smear propaganda from rivals, meant to paint the assassins as crazed junkies. Another theory says hashish might have been used, but as a tool, not for pleasure. Initiates may have been drugged early in their training to create hallucinatory visions of paradise, which were then linked to their loyalty to the order and its mission. After that, no drugs, just total obedience. Hassan built a cult of discipline and sacrifice, and any lapse, no matter who you were, was punished with death. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was strategy. A ruler who lived in extreme austerity while using manipulation as a weapon. This was a hardline, militarized theocracy, no taxes, just labor, no riches, just equality. And under that structure, Hassan laid the foundation for a network of loyal and lethal assassins. Let's be clear. Those who joined Hassan's organization never called themselves assassins or Hashashin. They referred to themselves as fida or fedayeen, those who had devoted themselves to a sacred cause and acted in the name of God. Recruits were often poor teenage boys, usually around 14. Training was brutal. They had to master every weapon of the era: archery, spears, knives. They learned to use poison, endure extreme hardship, survive on no food or water, and stand for hours pressed against a stone wall without moving. They had to fight multiple stronger opponents at once. The hazing was horrific. When these poor boys came to the gates of Alamut, they were turned away. The second time, they were stoned. The third, beaten with sticks. Only if they returned again and again, proving they were worthy, could they join. During training, they were cut with knives, beaten with clubs, and tested to their limit. Sound familiar? It's like something straight out of Game of Thrones, the unsullied army that feels no pain, or the House of Black and White, where initiates knock 3 times before being accepted. Valar Morghulis. Once accepted, the boys were trained and indoctrinated. Here's another key legend. Hassan ibn Sabbah used the story of the 13th Imam. How? He had lookalikes, doubles. One would appear, claiming to be Hassan, and then walk into a fire and burn alive. The next morning, the real Hassan would appear and say, "You saw me consumed by flames. Now I have risen." Naturally, this left a huge impression on people at the time. The idea of doubles surviving fire may have been part of folklore or deliberate myth-making, a way to frame Hassan as someone divine, immortal, magical, or capable of cheating death. Hassan ibn Sabbah was surrounded by an aura of mysticism and fear. His followers saw him as chosen, even saint-like. His enemies saw him as something demonic. Another tale was that he could raise the dead. A boy would be placed underground with only his head exposed through a hole, framed by a copper tray filled with blood to look like a severed head. Hassan would ask this dead follower questions, and the head would speak. "Great master," it would say, "let me tell you about the battle I fought with the vizier." Students would faint in awe. Of course, afterward, the boy was actually executed to prove the illusion was real. A third legendary story was about the Gardens of Paradise. Hassan would drug recruits with hashish until they passed out. Then they'd be carried to a hidden courtyard filled with beautiful women, fruits, wine, and luxury. They'd wake up thinking they were in heaven. After a day of bliss, they'd be drugged again and taken back to the barracks. Hassan would tell them, "That was paradise. That's what awaits you after your mission. You've seen it. You'll return, but only after completing your task." For poor, deeply religious youths, this was more than convincing. It was gospel. Of course, the training also required scholars, philosophers, and alchemists. These were kidnapped, brought to Alamut, and never allowed to leave. They worked closely with Hassan, educating his army of killers. But above all, aside from knowing herbs and poisons, you had to be able to kill. You had to win trust. You had to become someone else. There were no limits when it came to disguise. If your target was a Christian and Hassan ibn Sabbah ordered the kill, you could publicly renounce Islam, convert to Christianity, live as a Christian for years, and strike during Mass in a church. Nothing was off the table. You could pretend to be blind, a beggar, crippled, anything. You had to speak the local language of wherever your target lived. These were fully trained, highly adaptable killers, and they didn't just kill, they were theatrical. One assassin once posed as a blind cripple and lured enemy commanders one by one before killing them. When the Crusaders arrived, more on them later, the King of Jerusalem, Conrad of Montferrat, first allied with Hassan, then robbed Nizari merchants. In retaliation, Hassan ordered his death. Two assassins posed as devout Christians and lived in the city for 3 years. When Conrad's guard finally let down their guard, one of the assassins rushed forward and stabbed him with a poisoned dagger. Conrad survived, but the second assassin stepped out of the crowd and slit his throat. Poisoned weapons were a hallmark, designed to ensure the kill. Naturally, a sect so utterly obedient to its leader and so lethal terrified the entire Islamic world. They eliminated generals, viziers, and religious leaders of the Seljuks one after another. And when smart people are wiped out, only fools are left in charge, and so the state began to rot. That's what happened to the Seljuks. The assassins didn't destroy them outright, but they weakened them badly, triggering civil wars. After that, the Seljuks stopped being a threat to the old man of the mountain. But then the Crusaders arrived, fighting local Muslims. Small side note, in the Assassin's Creed games, the assassin's main enemy is the Templars. In reality, there was no such rivalry. Hassan ibn Sabbah didn't truly ally with anyone. When the Seljuks began fighting the Crusaders, Hassan welcomed it. "The enemy of my enemy is my friend," and cooperated with Crusaders, even taking assassination orders from them. When they later quarreled, he had the King of Jerusalem killed without hesitation. Rumor has it that Richard the Lionheart himself may have ordered the hit on Conrad to claim the throne. At one point, the assassins worked with Crusaders, later turned on them. Another victim was Count Raymond II, great-grandson of Anna Yaroslavna, Queen of France. The assassins became a political force. Orders came from across the region. Once a contract was accepted, it could not be canceled. Even if you made peace with your enemy, too late. The kill would still happen. That was the iron rule. You'll often read in books that even Europe feared the assassins. The logistics alone make it highly unlikely. No one was trekking to France for a hit, but Crusaders and merchants returning home brought the tales, and groups like the Templars used them to build their own mythos. Still, in the Arab world, Hassan was a true terror, and not just to rulers. Even Saladin, the legendary warrior who fought Richard the Lionheart and beat the Crusaders time and again, had trouble. According to legend, there were 8 assassination attempts on him. One seriously wounded him. Eventually, he made peace with Hassan. That gives you a sense of the power this group held. They moved in shadows, earned trust, and struck when no one expected. Anyone, a servant, a merchant, a guard, could be waiting to kill you. That kind of fear made the assassins a true political force. When we talk about absolute obedience, we have to mention one of the most famous legends about the Old Man of the Mountain. By this time, Hassan-i Sabbah was already dead, and the order was led by his successor. Around 1130, a Western visitor supposedly arrived. Some versions say it was a crusader, Count Henry of Champagne. That part of the story is questionable, as Henry lived later in the second half of the 12th century. But the legend has been passed down for centuries. It says the visitor came to the impenetrable fortress of Alamut, the same one said to be impossible to storm. During the meeting, he asked, "Is it really true that your men obey you without question?" The leader of the assassins said nothing. He simply gestured toward two guards standing on the edge of the wall. Without hesitation, they threw themselves off the cliff and died. The leader then calmly said, "If you like, another 8 will slit their own throats if you still have doubts." The guest supposedly replied, "I see. Thank you very much." Maybe it's just a legend, but it captures the chilling devotion and fear the assassins inspired. If the Old Man of the Mountain ordered your death, you died. Whether it was the hashish, the myth of the 13th Imam, or sheer fanaticism, these men were utterly loyal. After Hassan-i Sabbah's death, his state began to weaken, because his successors didn't want to live like ascetic mountain mystics. They wanted luxury, women, wine. We don't know for sure, but we do know the egalitarian commune began to crumble. A ruling elite emerged, wealth started to flow, and Alamut even minted its own coins, later discovered in ruins. Power, hierarchy, and internal corruption started breaking the state apart. Still, for a time, the myth of the assassins, the secretive killers who could be anyone, anywhere, kept the fear alive. Think of the faceless men from Game of Thrones. That's the assassins. They could take any identity and kill in 5 seconds. But in June of 1256, the world of Alamut and Hassan's heirs came to an end. A tidal wave approached that no one, not the Arabs, not the Europeans, not the Russians, could stop. The Mongols. They reached the borders of the Nizari state and began taking fortress after fortress, crushing resistance, slaughtering garrisons. Alamut itself resisted for almost 6 months, but according to legend, a traitor revealed a hidden path. The Mongols stormed the impregnable fortress and massacred everyone. By early 1257, the assassin state was essentially wiped out. Most strongholds surrendered to the Mongols, including Alamut, but 2 citadels kept fighting. The first was Lamassar, which held out for nearly a year after Alamut fell. The second was Gurdku, a fortress known for its near-impenetrable defenses. It became the order's last stronghold, holding out for almost 20 more years before finally falling to the Mongols in the 1270s. The Mongols unleashed horrific slaughter, killing up to 10,000 Nizaris. The survivors scattered. Some fled to Syria, others vanished into the Iranian mountains or blended into cities. But according to legend, they kept their networks. The story of assassins spread across the Middle East and impossible to track lived on. Now let's talk about the myths and legends. The story of Hashish in the Paradise Garden comes from the tales of the traveler Marco Polo. He claimed that during his journey through Asia, he heard of a sect whose members would enter a kind of paradise filled with pleasures before carrying out an assassination. According to him, young Fedayeen were drugged with hashish and woke up in a lush garden full of wine, women, and abundance, creating the illusion of heaven. They were then returned to reality and told, "Kill who you're ordered to kill, and if you die, you'll return to that paradise." Allegedly, this is why assassins died under torture, with smiles on their faces. They believed they were going back to bliss. But the story raises serious doubts. First, Marco Polo wasn't a contemporary of Hassan-i Sabbah and was writing about events that happened over 100 years before his journey. Second, he likely heard the story secondhand, not as an eyewitness. And third, the whole idea of a pleasure garden doesn't fit with the strict, fanatically ascetic system Hassan built, one that forbade wine, women, and all earthly pleasures. So the tale of hashish in paradise is probably a later myth born from a mix of Eastern folklore and Western fantasy. As for the Templars, well, they weren't yet powerful when the assassins were active, and the assassins took contracts from anyone, as long as the target didn't go against the interests of the Old Man of the Mountain. That's the story of the order, wrapped in legend, but grounded in the terrifying fact that for 200 years, they held viziers, caliphs, and entire kingdoms in fear. Some say they carried out 850 assassinations. I've only found about 15 confirmed in various sources, but according to legend, the fortress gates were covered in copper plaques bearing the names of the killers and their victims. So the legend is no joke. And this could be the end. But let's leave it with an ellipsis, because the Ismaili movement, religiously speaking, still exists today. After the Fall of Alamut, they scattered across various nearby countries, many settled in Persia. There the community grew stronger, still practicing their beliefs. The Shah of Iran tolerated them for a while, but eventually tensions arose between him and the Ismaili leader. After a falling out, the Ismaili Imam was forced to flee to India. Many of his followers migrated to India and Pakistan, and guess where their leader ended up? In the United Kingdom. There he became part of the aristocracy and high society. Many Nizaris followed, integrating into British life, with some joining the military, especially in the officer ranks. The order didn't vanish. It simply transformed. And here's where it gets interesting. A major conspiracy theory claims that the assassins' hidden knowledge, the esoteric wisdom reserved for the chosen few, was passed on to the Templars, then to the Freemasons, then to the Illuminati, and that now some invisible hand is guiding history from the shadows. Sounds ridiculous? Maybe. But look at the figure of Aga Khan IV, Karim al-Husseini. He led the Ismailis from 1957 until his death on February 4, 2025, over 65 years later. Who was he? A British aristocrat, a billionaire, one of the most influential yet discreet religious leaders of his time. His interests span the globe, some charitable, some commercial. He was a major philanthropist, a backer of cultural and humanitarian efforts, and also the leader of a very closed religious group. Aga Khan founded one of Europe's most luxurious resorts, Costa Smeralda in Sardinia. Before he arrived, it was a poor coastline where beachfront shacks were given to daughters because it was considered dangerous. He bought the land, built it up, and turned it into a magnet for Europe's elite. But that's not all. A French ethnographer named John Miller, who worked in Pakistan, claimed he met members of the local elite who told him the global Ismaili community still pays a tithe to Aga Khan. That, they said, is the source of his wealth. Of course, this sounds like a myth, and it probably is. But who knows? The assassins, crushed long ago by Hulagu Khan, may be gone in name, but in some distant form they may still be among us. In history, nothing is ever just a fairy tale. First they say it's only a myth. Then, well, maybe it's based on something. And finally, you find out that the myth was mostly truth, just hidden in plain sight. The story of the assassins isn't just a shadow from the past. It's a handcrafted system of power, fear, and faith that survived the centuries. Their fortresses are gone, their names forgotten, but their principles live on. Obedience, sacrifice, murder as a tool of politics. They vanished from the map but remained in myths, religions, and power structures. And who knows? Maybe the Order's most important rule still holds true. A true assassin never reveals himself.